The night before everything happened, a man I had known for exactly 4 days rolled his wheelchair into the doorway of his room at 2 in the morning, waited for me to walk past on my way to the coffee machine, and said 7 words that saved my family. He said, "When that grandson gets here, count the pages." Then he looked at me with the palest blue eyes I have ever seen on a living person and added, "Count them twice." 3 days later, I was standing in my dying sister's room, in front of a notary public, ordering her only grandson to get out. And the man who warned me was gone before I ever got the chance to thank him. But he left something for me at the front desk, with my name spelled wrong on the envelope, and I keep it in my nightstand drawer to this day. I want to tell you how all of that came to pass. But first, if you would do an old man a kindness, tell me down in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them, usually with my morning coffee, and some days those comments are the best conversation I get. And if stories like this one matter to you, go ahead and subscribe, because I'm going to tell you the whole thing, start to finish, and I will say up front that a few small details have been changed for the telling. The heart of it has not. The heart of it is as real as the floor under my feet. My name is Dale Pruitt. I am 66 years old, and I live outside Chattanooga, Tennessee, in the same brick house my wife Nadine and I bought in 1989. Nadine passed 2 years ago this spring, and I will not pretend the house has gotten any bigger since. For 39 years, I worked as a title abstractor for Hamilton County. If you do not know what that is, do not feel bad. Most people do not. My job was to sit in the deed room of the courthouse and trace who owned a piece of land, all the way back, deed by deed, sometimes to land grants older than the state itself. Other men read novels. I read legal descriptions. Beginning at an iron pin on the north margin of such and such road, thence east so many feet to a stone. 39 years of that will do something to a man. It makes you slow. It makes you suspicious of any paper anybody slides across a table at you. Nadine used to laugh because I once stood at a gas pump for 20 minutes, deciding whether the car wash was worth the extra $4. She said I was the only man in Tennessee who read the warranty card on a toaster. I carried a little folding magnifier in my shirt pocket every working day of my life, for reading faded ink in old record books, and the day I retired I could not bring myself to take it out of the pocket. It is still there. Remember that magnifier. It matters later. I tell you all this so you will understand something. The man in this story, the one who almost stood by and let it happen anyway, was not a careless man. He was a careful man who made one exception his whole life, and the exception was family. I checked everything on this earth except the people who shared my blood. I thought that was loyalty. It took a dying stranger in a hallway to teach me it was blindness wearing loyalty's coat. The call came on a Tuesday evening at the end of September. It was my sister's neighbor from up in Bardstown, Kentucky, a good woman who kept a key to the house, and she told me Addie had been moved into a hospice outside Louisville, and that Addie had been asking for me. I did not pack a proper bag. I put 3 shirts and a toothbrush in a duffel, locked the back door, and drove 6 hours north in the dark with the radio off. I need to tell you who Addie was, because none of the rest makes sense without her. Adelaide is 9 years older than me. Our mother died in the winter of 1964, when Addie was 13 and I was 5, and our father, God rest him, was a good provider and a poor everything else. So it was Addie who walked me to school. Addie who learned to cook off the back of soup cans. Addie who sat up with me through the chicken pox and signed my report cards in a handwriting she practiced to look grown. She did not raise me instead of having a childhood. She raised me with the childhood she gave up. When she married Emmett Cantrell and moved to Kentucky in the early 70s, I cried at the wedding, and not the good kind of crying. Emmett was a lineman for the Rural Electric Cooperative for 40 years, a big quiet man who could splice wire in an ice storm, and the two of them bought a little white house on 12 acres outside Bardstown with an old tobacco barn and, next to it, 62 acres of hardwood timber that Emmett bought cheap in the 80s because nobody wanted ground that steep. Their only boy, Roy, was killed in a car accident back in 2009. Emmett went in 2017. His heart just finished. After that it was Addie alone in the White House with her flower beds and her church, and 2 grandchildren grown and gone. Lacey, Roy's girl, teaches 4th grade up in Dayton, Ohio, 2 kids of her own, and she called her grandmother every Sunday evening at 7 like it was printed in the church bulletin. And there was Trent, Roy's boy, down in Louisville, doing something with mortgages. I want to be careful how I introduce Trent, because hindsight is a liar. It wants me to tell you I always knew. I did not always know. I knew he hugged you a beat too long. I knew he had a way of steering you by the elbow when you walked, like you were a client being shown to a closing. That is all I knew, and I made nothing of it. That was my first mistake, and it was not my last. The hospice sat off a county road east of Louisville, a low brick building with good landscaping, and the lobby smelled like fresh paint trying to cover something older. The nurse at the desk gave me a look I could not read at the time and said my sister had been asking when I would come. Addie was in the third room on the left, pancreatic cancer. By the time I got there, she was down under 100 pounds, and her hands shook when she held the cup of ice chips. But her eyes were still Addie's eyes, and the first thing she did was grab my wrist with more strength than I thought she had and say, "You drove all night, you old fool." Then she cried a little, and so did I, and neither of us mentioned it. Across the hall was a man in a wheelchair with a plaid blanket over his knees. 80s, big hands, a face like a creek bank, all weathered folds. The first afternoon I nodded at him, and he nodded back, and did not speak. I noticed he had a habit. Every so often he would rap 2 knuckles on the arm of that wheelchair. Twice, a sharp little double knock, the way a man taps a gavel. I learned from a nurse his name was Harlan Voss, that he had been a livestock auctioneer over in Shelbyville for 50-some years, and that in 4 months he had received exactly 1 visitor, a fellow from his old church who came at Christmas with a poinsettia and stayed 11 minutes. She had counted. Nurses count things like that. The second day I carried him one of the muffins from the family kitchen, and he took it and said thank you kindly, and studied me for a second longer than the muffin called for, and that was all. Those first days I just sat with my sister. We talked when she could, and I held her hand when she could not. She slept in pieces, the way the dying do, and on the second afternoon, half in and half out of the morphine, she said something that I filed away without understanding it. She said, quiet, with her eyes closed, "The little papers were fine, Dale. The little papers did not matter, but the girl stays on. Lacey stays on like it is written." I asked her, "Stays on what, honey?" But she was under again. When the nurse came in, I mentioned it, and the nurse said morphine talk. They all do it, and patted the blanket and went on. Later, going through Addie's pocketbook for her reading glasses, I found a folded brochure from Cane Run Baptist Youth Camp, the little church camp east of Bardstown where Roy had gone as a boy, and on the back of it, in Addie's handwriting, 3 words. For the kids. I put it back where I found it. I want you to hold on to that brochure and hold on to the little papers, because I did not, and I should have. It was the 3rd night that something shifted. Past midnight, I stepped out to walk the hall and get my blood moving, and Harlan Voss was awake in his chair with the lamp low. And as I passed, he said, without any lead-up at all, "Your sister talks through that wall at night." I stopped. I said, "Does she keep you up?" He said, "Son, at my age, sleep is a rumor." Then he said, "She is worried about something, and it is not the dying she has made her peace with. She keeps saying a name. Lacey. She keeps saying Lacey stays on, and she keeps saying she should have called the lawyer sooner." I stood there in that hallway and felt something cold walk down my back, 1 vertebra at a time. I thanked him. I told myself an 84-year-old man hearing a dying woman through a wall at midnight was not evidence of anything. I went back in and sat down and watched my sister breathe. The 4th night is the one I told you about at the start. 2 in the morning, me shuffling toward the coffee machine, and Harlan Voss parked square in his doorway like a man working a sale, waiting on me. He lifted 1 finger, the small kind of gesture that means, "Come here," without making a sound. I pulled the visitor chair over and sat. He looked at me a long time with those pale eyes. Then he said, "The grandson comes tomorrow." I said, "How in the world do you know that?" He said, "Because a young fellow called the front desk twice today asking what hours a notary could get in on a Saturday, and I was sitting by the desk both times, and I have spent 50 years listening to what people ask for when they think nobody is doing arithmetic." I said, "Maybe it is just paperwork. Everybody has paperwork at the end." And Harlan Voss leaned forward and said the thing I will hear in my head until they lay me down. He said, "I sold cattle on a bid for half a century. I never once got cheated by a stranger. You know why? Because I was watching the strangers. Son, when that grandson gets here, count the pages. Whatever he hands you, count the pages, and count them twice. And do not sign one thing in this building. Then he sat back and rapped his two knuckles on the chair arm twice, and that was the whole conversation. I went back to my sister's room and I sat in the dark, and I did what careful men do best. I explained it all away. I told myself he was a lonely old man with a bad story of his own, one of those men who sees a thief in every doorway because a thief once came through his. Trent was my great-nephew. I had watched him open Christmas presents on Addie's floor. I had stood at Roy's funeral with my hand on that boy's shoulder while he shook. The idea that he was driving up here to do something crooked to his own dying grandmother did not compute, so I dismissed it. And I have thanked God every day since that Harlan Voss was harder to dismiss than my own good sense, because his words stayed lodged in my shirt pocket right next to that magnifier, and the next day I needed both. Trent got there around 11 Saturday morning. Charcoal jacket, no tie, gray coming in nice at the temples, the kind of appearance that has been thought about. He hugged me before he looked at his grandmother, and he held it a beat too long, and he smelled like airport coffee and good aftershave. He said, "Uncle Dale, I am so sorry. I got here as fast as I could." He had a pen clipped in his breast pocket with his company's name on the barrel, and while he sat by Addie's bed saying the right things in a low voice, his thumb kept clicking that pen. Click, click. She was awake, but only just, and at one point she turned her head and found my eyes over his shoulder, and she opened her mouth like there was something she needed to hand me, and then she closed it again. I have replayed that little moment 1,000 times. She looked at me. Then she closed her mouth. Shame is quiet like that. I know now what she could not bring herself to say, and I will get to it. And when I do, I want you to be gentle with her in your mind, because she had spent 60 years being the strong one, and the strong ones would rather die than tell you they got fooled. After an hour or so, Trent touched my elbow. There was that steering hand, and said, "Uncle Dale, can we step down to the cafeteria and talk about arrangements?" We got coffee neither of us wanted, and he laid his hands flat on the table like a man opening a file. He said, "I am going to be straight with you because you are the only other adult in this family who understands money. Grandma's biggest asset is the home place and the timber ground. Between them, in this market, you are looking at somewhere north of 600,000. And here is the problem nobody wants to say out loud. End-of-life care eats estates alive. If she lingers, if there are bills, Medicaid can come after that house. I see it every single week in my line of work. Families lose the whole farm to the state over paperwork they could have done in an afternoon." I nodded slow, because I had heard a version of that fear my whole life. In the deed room, at church, at every fish fry in 2 states. He saw the nod and kept going. "So what Grandma wants, what she asked me to set up, is a simple transfer. The property comes over to me now, clean, while she can still sign, so it is protected. I handle everything after. Sale, expenses, taxes, all of it, and the family is taken care of. There is a mobile notary who can be here at 4 this afternoon. All we need from you is a witness signature. 10 minutes, Uncle Dale, and she can stop worrying and rest easy." He said it with a face as calm and clean as a Sunday shirt, like we were talking about getting the oil changed. And I will confess something to you. For about 30 seconds, it sounded reasonable. That is how these things work. They do not sound like robbery. They sound like an errand. What broke the spell was small. I asked, "What does Lacey think about all this?" And Trent smiled just a little, just at the corner, and said, "Lacey is not really a numbers person. And anyway, the insurance takes care of Lacey. That was all worked out years ago. This is just cleanup." And somewhere in the back of my head, a dying woman's voice said, "The girl stays on." And an auctioneer's voice said, "Count the pages." I said, "I would like to read everything before 4 o'clock. Bring it to me now, and I will go through it." And Trent's face did a thing I had never seen it do. The smile stayed put, but behind his eyes something shut, soft, like a door closing down a long hallway. Half a second. Then he said, "Of course, Uncle Dale. Whatever makes you comfortable. Although honestly, you are grieving. You have been up here 4 nights. I would hate to bury you in legal language. It is all standard." I said, Son, I read legal language for 39 years for a living. Standard is my favorite kind. Bring it all. He said his printer situation was complicated and it would all be there at 4 with the notary, and he went off to make calls in the parking lot, and I went back upstairs. Passing Harlan's door, I did not stop and he did not speak. He just looked at me and rapped the chair arm twice, and I nodded once, and that was us understanding each other completely. The notary came at 4 on the nose. A trim Latino gentleman in his 50s named Mr. Reyes. Brown cardigan, leather folio, the unhurried manner of a man who has done 1,000 bedside signings and treats everyone like church. Trent walked him in warm as July, and they set up a little folding tray over Addie's bed. And Addie was awake, propped up, her white hair combed, and scared. I could see it now that I knew to look. Not confused. Scared. Trent laid a stack of papers on the tray and said, "Grandma, it is just like we talked about," and clicked that pen and held it out toward her. And I said, "Before anything gets signed, I am going to read every page out loud, so my sister hears exactly what she is putting her name to." Trent said, "Uncle Dale, the man's time." Mr. Reyes said, "Sir, I have got nowhere to be, and I never mind a careful family. Bless that man." I picked up the stack, and the first thing I did was exactly what Harlan told me. I counted the pages. A deed runs 3, maybe 4 pages. This stack was 14. I counted it again. 14. Under the deed there was a second document, a durable power of attorney, naming Trent Cantrell agent over every financial affair Addie had, effective immediately. And under that, a third. A change of beneficiary form for a life insurance policy through the Rural Electric Cooperative, $250,000, with Trent's name typed fresh on the beneficiary line. It was a form set, the kind with a carbon copy behind it, and I took my old magnifier out of my shirt pocket, 39 years of habit, and I held it over that carbon, and under the fresh typing you could still read the impression of the name that was being erased. Lacey. I stood there holding 14 pages, and the room got very quiet except for the oxygen machine clicking. I said, "Trent, the deed I understand you asked me about. What are these other 2? He said, "Those are just protective, Uncle Dale, in case things change fast and somebody has to act." I said, "She has days, son. The doctor told you that this morning. What is a power of attorney for?" He said, "Please, this is not the time." I said, "And why is the insurance being changed off of Lacey?" And then I did the second thing, and this one Harlan did not have to teach me, because 39 years in a deed room did. I turned back to page 2 of the deed, and I read the legal description out loud, slow, the way I used to read them to young lawyers who were in a hurry. A certain tract or parcel of land lying in Nelson County, Kentucky, and so on, together with an adjoining tract containing 62 acres, more or less. I stopped. I looked up. I said, "This is not just the house, Trent. This deed carries the timber ground too." And my sister, who had not said a full sentence all afternoon, made a sound I will carry to my grave. Not a word. Just a small broken sound, and tears started running sideways down into her pillow, because the timber was for the kids. It was for Cane Run Camp. She had promised it, in that handwriting on the back of a brochure. For the kids, and she had been lying in that bed for days trying to find the strength to tell somebody before it was too late. I am going to pause my story right here for just a second and say this straight into the microphone. If you have an Addie in your life, somebody who was always the strong one, go easy on them, and go check on them, because the strong ones do not call for help. And if this story is landing anywhere near your own family, do me a favor at this exact moment. Share it with the one person you are thinking of right now, and subscribe if you have not, because what happened next in that room is the reason I tell this story at all. I took out my phone. I said, "Trent, we are going to call your sister right now and put her on the speaker." He said, "Uncle Dale, you are exhausted. You have been here 4 nights. I said, "Then my hands know the way without me." Lacey picked up on the second ring, because it was near her Sunday call time anyway. That girl was always by the phone for her grandmother. I said, "Lacey, honey, it is Uncle Dale. I am standing in your grandmother's room with your brother and a notary. Did you ever agree to come off of Grandma's life insurance from the co-op?" There was a silence with a whole marriage worth of meaning in it. Then she said, "Slow. Come off of what?" Trent started fast. "Lace, hi. This is a misunderstanding. These are protective documents." And Lacey said 4 words, and they were not to him. She said, "Uncle Dale, sign nothing." And then Mr. Reyes, that good and unhurried man, did the thing that ended it. He leaned down close to my sister, gentle as a deacon, and said, "Ma'am, before I could ever notarize anything today, I need you to tell me in your own words what this paper does." Addie looked at him. Her mouth worked, and she could not do it. Not because her mind was gone, because her heart was breaking in front of witnesses. And Mr. Reyes straightened up and put the cap on his pen and said, "Then we are done here today, folks. I am not able to proceed, and I would not be able to proceed tomorrow either. That is the rule. And it is a good rule." The pen in Trent's hand was going click, 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 fast now, a little machine gun of panic, and the boy I had watched open presents on the floor was gone out of his face entirely, and somebody else was in there doing arithmetic. And then it came out of him, low and furious, the truth arriving the only way it ever arrived with Trent, which is by accident. He said, "You do not understand what is on top of me. 2 of my properties are underwater. I am personally signed on 210,000. The note balloons in 60 days. The licensing board is sending me letters. This ground is just sitting there. She does not even use the timber. It was going to be temporary." And I said, "Quiet," because Nadine always told me I got quietest right before I meant it most. I said, "Get out of this room." He said my name. I said, "Get out of your grandmother's room, and do not come back through that door." And he gathered his 14 pages and his clicking pen, and he walked out past Mr. Reyes, who stepped aside like a man avoiding a spill, and I heard the lobby door hiss, and that was the last time Trent Cantrell ever stood in the same room as his grandmother. I sat down on the edge of the bed and took my sister's hand. She was crying without any sound at all, just water and years coming out of her, and now she could finally say it. And she did, in pieces, over that evening and the next morning. The little papers. For about a year, Trent had been coming around with little papers, a signature card to be added to her checking account so he could help with bills, an authorization here, a form there, each one small, each one reasonable, each one a fence post, and she never saw the fence until she was inside it. And when she finally felt uneasy, this summer, she was ashamed. She had raised me to read everything, and she had signed things her grandson slid across her own kitchen table because telling him no felt like calling him a thief. The week they moved her into hospice, she asked the social worker to set up a call with her lawyer in Bardstown for Monday. Trent found out about that call. The notary was booked for Saturday. You can do that arithmetic yourself. Addie passed 4 days later, early on a Thursday morning, with the first frost on the grass outside her window. Lacey had driven down and was holding one hand and I was holding the other, and it was quiet and it was gentle, and Trent was not there, and I have decided that is between him and God. The week after the funeral, Lacey and I sat down in Bardstown with Carol Ann Meeks, who had been Addie's lawyer for 25 years, and had a casserole from the visitation still in her office refrigerator. She pulled the real will, the one Addie and Emmett had done properly years back. The house and the 12 acres were to be sold and split evenly between the 2 grandchildren. The 62 acres of timber went outright to Cane Run Baptist Youth Camp, exactly as promised, deeded for the kids. The insurance was Lacey's, all $250,000, set up that way after Emmett died, because, and Carol Ann read us the note in the file in Addie's own hand, Trent has had his help already. There was a checking account with about $40,000 in it, split 3 ways, with the third share going to the camp's scholarship fund. Every single provision, the 14 pages in that hospice room would have flipped. Carol Ann took off her reading glasses and told us 2 things I want you to hear, because you can check both of them yourself today, and I hope you do. She said, first, that Medicaid protection story he sold you is not just a lie, it is backwards. Medicaid looks back 5 full years at every transfer you make. A deathbed deed like that would not have protected your sister. It would have disqualified her. And second, she said, in this state or any state, a deathbed transfer into the pocket of the one person holding the pen does not buy a family protection. It buys them a lawsuit. Then she asked me the same question the lawyer in every story like mine gets asked. Where did the instinct come from to count those pages? And I told her about the man across the hall. That Saturday I drove back up to the hospice with a box of pastries and a card I had written by hand. And the nurse at the front desk saw me coming and her face fell before I said a word. Harlan Voss had passed on Wednesday, 2 days after Addie, quiet, in his sleep, and his room already faced the parking lot empty. I stood there holding a box of pastries like a fool, and the nurse said, "Wait, are you Mr. Pruitt?" and went in the back, and came out with an envelope with my name on it, spelled Pruitt, in a shaky, upslanted hand. She said he left it Tuesday and told her, "If the tall one comes back, this is his. If he does not, pitch it." I took it out to the bench by the entrance and sat in the cold October air and opened it. Inside was a single sheet, and it was not writing paper. It was the back of an old auction sale bill, cattle and equipment, from years gone by, folded soft as cloth. And this is what it said, near as I can bear to share it. Mr. Pruitt. I do not know how it went with the grandson, and I did not ask the nurses because it was not my business past the warning. In 2009, my brother's boy had me sign my auction barn over to him for tax reasons. I had run that barn 31 years. I signed it in his kitchen in about 4 minutes, and I never saw the inside of it again. And I found out after that, 2 men who knew me my whole life had suspected what that boy was and said nothing, because it was not their place. I have had a lot of hours in this chair to think about their place. When an auctioneer brings the gavel down, the sale is final. That is what the 2 knocks mean. Done is done. Nobody warned me before my gavel came down, so I decided a long while back that if I ever saw another man walking toward his, I would do the warning myself, whether it was my place or not. I hope you counted the pages. I hope you counted them twice. Whatever happened, son, you sit with your sister and do not waste her last days being angry. Angry is for later, and later is longer than you think. Harlan Voss. I sat on that bench a long time. A nurse came out once and asked if I was all right. And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am all right. I am just going to sit here a little while." He watched the strangers his whole life and got robbed by his own blood, and he spent some of the last breath he had warning mine. It was not his place. He made it his place. That is the whole sermon, and a dying auctioneer preached it to me on the back of a sale bill. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, but these things have roots, and roots come up when you pull. In the spring, a letter found me down in Chattanooga, forwarded through the funeral home, from a woman named Corinne Ashby over in Elizabethtown. Her husband had passed that winter, and going through his desk, she had found a spiral notebook where the old man kept accounts he was too ashamed to speak of while he lived, and one page had a name and a number on it. Trent Cantrell, $41,000, loaned across 2 years and never a dime repaid. She was writing to ask whether there was some way to make a claim, and how she had found me was the obituary I helped Lacey write. I called her, and we talked for better than an hour, and her voice shook the whole time, not for the money, she said, but because her husband had carried it alone. I called Lacey. Lacey called Carol Ann. And what came up out of the ground over the next year was a pattern going back most of a decade. Money borrowed from his father's old friends, from an elderly client or two who trusted him because he had a title and a firm handshake. Fix and flip properties bought with hard money at interest that would make a pawnbroker blush. Everything personally guaranteed, everything rolling forward onto the next borrowed dollar. The scheme in that hospice room, we came to understand, was not the beginning of anything. It was the last roll of the dice. With that ground in his name, he could have borrowed against it inside a week and stayed ahead of his creditors another season. About a year and a half after Addie passed, Trent pleaded guilty to 2 counts of financial exploitation involving 2 elderly clients over in Louisville, 4 years, plus restitution he will be paying past the day I am gone. We never pursued what happened in the hospice, and people ask me why, and I give them the honest answer. It would have been hard to prove, and we had already kept everything that mattered. And Lacey did not want her children growing up as the kids from the trial. She writes to him sometimes. I have not. Maybe someday. That is between me and the version of that boy who used to open presents on his grandmother's floor. Lacey and I started something small after that. We did not call it a foundation. We are not foundation people. Once a month, she does an evening at her church up in Dayton, and I do one at the senior center near me and another at churches around Chattanooga when they ask. And we call the talk, Count the Pages. And mostly what we do is tell this story and then sit down and listen. And I will tell you what I have learned from 2 years of listening. What happened to my family is not rare. I have heard my own story back, with the names changed, from more people than I can count on both hands twice over. A grandson who is helping with the accounts, a daughter who knows just the right fellow to set up the trust, a nephew who needs one signature this afternoon, before the notary leaves, before mother wakes up, before daddy passes. It is happening today, in every state, to careful people, to people who read the warranty card on the toaster. So, let me hand you the tools plain, the way I hand them out on folding chairs in fellowship halls. If anybody is rushing you, the rush is the tell. Count the pages, and count them twice, because the crooked ones ride in under the honest ones. Read the property description out loud, all of it, because what a deed carries is in the boring part. Call the one person in the family who has nothing to gain, and put them on the speaker. And know these two things you can verify for yourself. Medicaid looks back 5 full years, so anybody selling you a panic transfer is selling you a trap, and a notary is required to walk away if the signer cannot say what the paper does. So never let anybody treat the notary like a rubber stamp, because that stranger in the cardigan might be the last honest checkpoint in the room. There are 3 pictures in my head now when I think about how it all came out, and I will leave you with them in the order they happened. The first is from this past June, at Cane Run Camp, on the 62 acres of steep hardwood nobody wanted. The camp cut a trail and cleaned out the old pond, and I stood up on the rise with Lacey while her 2 kids and about 30 others fished bluegill out of that pond, hollering like it was the ocean, and Lacey's boy, who is 9, caught the first fish of his life on ground. His great-great-grandmother promised a way for exactly that purpose and did not know a thing about any of it, which is just how Addie would have wanted it. The second is from later that same week, when I drove past the hospice on my way home and pulled in without quite deciding to, and stood in the parking lot a minute, looking up at the window of the room across the hall from my sister's, and rapped my 2 knuckles, twice, on the roof of my truck. Done is done. And the third picture is the one I have never told anybody the full truth about until right now. The camp built a new dining hall this year, partly with the scholarship money from Addie's account, and the board wanted to put her name over the door, and I had to tell them no, because Carol Ann had shown me the green ledger book where my sister kept every promise she ever made, and next to the entry about the timber, in that steady church bulletin handwriting, she had written, "And do not let them put my name on anything. Glory goes up, not sideways." So the board asked me, well then, whose name? And I told them a story about a hallway at 2 in the morning. And that is how there came to be, on a hill in Nelson County, Kentucky, a plain cedar sign over a dining hall full of loud, happy children, reading Voss Hall, after a livestock auctioneer who never set foot on the place, never met my sister, never knew a single one of those kids, and saved every bit of it with 7 words to a stranger because once, a long time ago, nobody warned him. His picture from the auction barn hangs inside by the kitchen window. The camp kids have invented about 9 legends for who he was. Not one of them is as good as the truth. So here is the end of it. And I will say it as plain as he said it to me. If something in your family has been gnawing at you, some little paper, some helpful arrangement, some feeling that does not add up, that feeling might be your business. It might be the only business that matters this week. The cost of asking and being wrong is one awkward Sunday dinner. The cost of staying quiet and being right is somebody's whole life. If a paper has to be signed today, before the notary leaves, it does not. The people who love you will wait a day. The people who will not wait a day have just told you everything. Tell me in the comments who your Harlan was, the person who told you a hard truth when it was not their place, because I read everyone, and somebody scrolling past might need your story worse than they need mine. Take care of yourselves out there. Count the pages. Count them twice. And when the moment comes, and for most of us it comes at least once, be the one who says something in the hallway.